As the world waits for Putin's next move, it's his continued threat of nuclear war that has President Biden doubling down on a chilling warning in an exclusive interview with CNN.
He, in fact, cannot continue with impunity to talk about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon as if that's a rational thing to do. The mistakes get made, and the miscalculation could occur. No one can be sure what would happen, and it could end in Armageddon.
But the president also stressed he still doesn't think Putin will actually resort to nukes despite his losses and desperation. CNN's Caitlin Collins is at the White House with more on this. Caitlin, a clear and carefully worded message here from the president.
Yeah, he seems to be, really clarifying what he was saying in that closed-door fundraiser last week when he first was talking about the idea of Armageddon here and saying that he believes basically the world is on the closest brink of nuclear war that it has been since the 1960s when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, really trying to clarify what he was saying there and also talking about what he thinks about Putin overall, saying he does believe he is still a rational actor, that despite what you've heard from some other world leaders and intelligence experts and what they've speculated about Putin's mindset here. But what President Biden said to Jake Tapper was that he does believe he is a rational actor who made a decision that was not rational. By sending his troops into Ukraine, he says he believes he basically misjudged the situation and thought what he was going into was going to look a lot different than it does. Here's what he told Jake Tapper.
I think he is a rational actor who's miscalculated significantly. He thought he was going to be welcomed with open arms, that this has been the home of Mother Russia in Kyiv, and he was going to be welcomed, and I think he just totally miscalculated.
And today, as President Biden was leaving the White House following that interview he did yesterday, he said that he believes the latest Russian attacks on civilian targets are brutal, that they are beyond the pale. He was also asked about a comment he made yesterday where he said he doesn't see himself sitting down to meet with Putin about Ukraine overall, but he said maybe if there is a situation like at the G20 summit with world leaders gathering in Bali in November, and it was to talk about Brittany Griner or one of those detained Americans, that is something he could see being feasible. But today when he was asked if there's been any movement in that space, he said, quote, not with Putin.
He talked about this in his exclusive interview with Jake Tapper last night, where he says he believes Putin is rational. However, he says Putin needs to change his behavior, that no rational leader would be threatening the use of potentially of a tactical nuclear weapon.
How realistic is it, do you think, that Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon?
Well, I don't think he will, but I think it's irresponsible for him to talk about it. The idea that a world leader of one of the largest nuclear powers in the world says he may use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, he, in fact, cannot continue with impunity to talk about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon as if that's a rational thing to do. The mistakes get made, and the miscalculation could occur. No one can be sure what would happen, and it could end in Armageddon.
The Armageddon line he used at a fundraiser in private. You're making the point there that Putin needs to stop this because somebody might see some action, misinterpret what it is, and make a mistake, even if Putin's not going to use a tactical nuclear weapon. You just don't talk about it because that gets everybody on edge.
Right. And that is Biden, which when he was asked about, or when his aides were asked about the Armageddon comment after he made it initially, this is the president trying to be very realistic and very stark about what the stakes are. The intelligence officials have said there's no change to the nuclear posture. They don't expect anything imminent anytime soon. But he's being very clear, saying that we could be headed back to 1962. This could be the greatest challenge since then. So that's the point that he gets across. I think there have been other times during the crisis, during this war, where he has been much more aggressive in his rhetoric. But he is certainly standing by it now because this is what he wants to convey to the American public about what could happen if something goes horribly wrong.
And both presidents are expected to be at the G20 in Indonesia coming up. That would be a chance, even given the dicey politics of the moment, the disagreements of the moment, to look Putin in the eye and make that case. But listen, the president says, I don't think so unless.
Look, I have no intention of meeting with him, but for example, if he came to me at the G20 and said, I want to talk about the release of Griner, I'd meet with him. I mean, it would depend, but I can't imagine he's committed war crimes. So I don't see any rationale to meet with him now.
Couple interesting points there. One, repeating again that Putin has committed war crimes. Two, also saying that there is openness to meeting with him, but on an issue that directly involves the U.S. and Russia, that being the detainment of Brittany Griner. And then he went on to say as well that, look, our focus right now is when it comes to the invasion of Ukraine, involving Ukraine in any talks with Putin or anyone else. He emphasized that as well. But the Brittany Griner issue, that is interesting, as obviously the White House has been facing pressure as well at times to message more about this, to talk more about this as well, and to take some action on her release.